Tonight, before we begin, picture a small wooden shed in a courtyard in Paris on a cold night near the end of the old century. It has a leaking glass roof and a bare earth floor, and in the winter the rain finds its way in and stands in shallow pools between the packing cases. There is an iron stove in one corner that never quite warms the room, and there are tall windows gone grey with grime. And there is the smell of tar and hot metal and something sharp underneath it that catches at the back of the throat. And there in the near dark, a young woman in a stained work smock is standing over an iron basin as tall as she is, stirring a boiling mass of black mineral pitch with a long iron rod that is nearly as heavy as she is, hour after hour after hour, until her arms shake and her back aches and the steam curls up into the cold and clings to the glass above her. She is not being made to do this by anyone. No one has ordered it. She has chosen it, freely, this endless stirring of tons of black rock in a freezing shed, because she believes there is something hidden inside it, something no one has ever seen, and she means to find it if it takes her the rest of her life, which, in a manner of speaking, it will. And when at last, some nights, she puts the rod down and turns off the small lamp and the two of them stand together in the dark shed, tired past speaking, they can see a faint bluish light glowing on the shelves along the wall, in the little glass tubes ranged there in the blackness. A soft, cool living glow, like something remembered rather than something burning. That is where we are going tonight, and long before it, and long after it. But not yet. There is no hurry at all. Settle now into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight. Let the room be as it is. Let the lamp grow dim, or let the screen dim itself, and stay dim, and let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has pushed them, one quiet inch, and then another. You do not have to follow every word. The words are only here to keep you company down the long soft slope into sleep, and if you drift off before the shed and before the glowing tubes and before all the rest of it, that is not a failure, that is exactly the point, and the story will still be here patient, tomorrow. If you enjoy these long, quiet lives told slowly in the dark, you might, if you truly want to, and only if you truly want to, leave a like or follow along, because it does help these little films find the other people who are lying awake tonight in the dark just as you are. And if you would, leave your town and your local time down in the comments before you go under, because there is a strange, gentle comfort in scrolling through them and seeing how many of us are awake at once, all over the turning world, listening to the same soft voice. And now let the day go. Let it slip down off your shoulders and pool on the floor like a coat you no longer need to wear, and let us go back, very slowly, to a city and a century that are gone. To begin at the beginning, we have to go back before the woman in the shed existed, back before the glowing tubes, to a flat grey country that at the time did not officially exist at all. In the middle of the 19th century, there was no country called Poland on any map that the great powers of Europe recognised. There had been once a large and ancient kingdom of that name, but over the course of the previous century, three enormous neighbours, Russia and Prussia and Austria, had reached across their borders and taken it apart between them, slice by slice, in three great helpings, until there was nothing of it left to govern, and the Poland into which our story begins was a memory that several million people carried around inside themselves in a land that belonged, on paper, to somebody else. The largest share of it, including the old capital of Warsaw, had gone to the Russian Empire, and it was ruled from St. Petersburg by a Tsar, who regarded the Polish language and the Polish faith and the Polish memory as a kind of infection to be slowly, patiently cured. And so in the schools of Warsaw, the children were taught in Russian by Russian inspectors out of Russian books, and were made to recite the history of their conquerors and to pretend, for the length of a lesson, that the country under their own feet had never been. It is into this quiet, watchful, occupied city that we go now on the 7th of November in the year 1867, to a modest apartment attached to a boys' school, where a physics teacher and his wife welcomed their fifth and last child, a daughter, and named her Maria Salomea Sklodowska. In the family, because she was the youngest and the smallest, and much loved, She was almost never called Maria. She was called Mania, and sometimes, when she was very small, Minutia, and it is as Mania that she moved through the first rooms of her life, the last of 5, running to keep up with the others. The world will one day know her by a shorter, harder, more famous name, a French name she has not yet been given and cannot yet imagine. But that is decades away and many countries away, and tonight we are in no hurry to get there. Tonight she is only Mania, the youngest, in a cold flat in a captured city, and she is very small, and she is, even now, watching everything. Her father was named Ladislaw Sklodowski, and he was a teacher of physics and mathematics, a serious, upright, gentle, faintly stubborn man who loved learning with his whole heart and had a great deal of trouble holding on to money, which is a combination that tends to produce a household that is rich in books and thin in comfort. He came from the minor Polish gentry, a class that had a great deal of pride and, by this point in history, almost no land. And he had made himself into a schoolmaster, because a schoolmaster was a thing a clever poor Pole was still, for the moment, permitted to be. He taught in the government schools, under the Russian inspectors, and he chafed against them quietly all his life, and more than once his quiet chafing cost him a post and a salary and moved the family down another rung into smaller rooms, with more boarders crammed in to make the rent. He kept in the apartment, on the shelves and in the cabinets, the instruments of his trade, and these are worth pausing on, because they are the first things his youngest daughter is known to have loved with a kind of wonder. There was a glass case of physical apparatus, brought home when the schools were no longer allowed to teach such things properly, and in it were gold-leaf electroscopes and glass tubes and a small precise balance and mineralogical specimens, and a barometer, mysterious brass and glass objects that caught the light. And the smallest child in the house used to stand in front of the case looking in. At them, not knowing their names, feeling only that they were beautiful and that they meant something, and her father, passing, would sometimes stop and tell her, gently, what each one was for. She did not understand the answers. She remembered the feeling of being told. Her mother was named Bronislawa, and she was, if anything, the more remarkable of the two parents, a calm, capable, deeply devout woman who had run a respected boarding school for girls before her marriage, and who carried herself with a quiet authority that everyone in the household felt. But over the youngest child's early years a shadow moved across the mother that the child was too small to name. Bronislawa had contracted tuberculosis, the slow wasting consumption that killed so many in that century, and she was slowly, gracefully dying of it through the whole of Mania's childhood. And because in those days it was thought the disease might pass from a mother's touch, she did not embrace her youngest daughter, did not kiss her, kept a careful, loving, heartbreaking distance, and ate from her own separate plate, with her own separate cutlery. And the child grew up adored by a mother who could not, for the child's own sake, hold her. It is a strange, quiet, formative grief to be loved fiercely from a step away, and it left its mark. The family was large and warm and clever and increasingly poor, and it kept being visited by loss. There were 5 children. The eldest was a girl, Zofia, called Zosia, bright and dramatic and the darling of the little ones, who used to make up plays and stories to keep them all entertained in the crowded flat. Then came the only boy, Joseph, who would grow up to be a doctor. Then 2 more girls, Bronislawa, called Bronya, who would become a doctor too, and who matters enormously to this story, and Helena, called Hella. And then, last, Mania. They were, by all accounts, an exceptional set of children, quick and hungry to learn, and their poverty had a particular quality to it. The genteel poverty of educated people who have come down in the world and mean to climb back up through their minds because they have nothing else left to climb with. To bring in money, the father took boarders into the already crowded apartment, boys from the provinces attending the school, so that the family's own rooms shrank and shrank, and the children slept on sofas and got up early so the dining table could be laid for other people's sons, and the air was always full of the sound of a dozen boys and the smell of a dozen boys' dinners. And it was one of these boarders, most likely, who brought into the house the typhus that killed the eldest child. Zofia caught it, the fever took hold, and in the year 1876, when Mania was 8 years old, the bright dramatic sister who had made up all the plays died of it, and the family that had been so full went quietly one place emptier. And then, less than 2 years later, in the spring of 1878, when Mania was 10, the long patient shadow finally finished its work, and the mother Bronislawa died of her consumption, calm and clear-eyed to the end, having received the last rites, leaving behind a husband and 4 surviving children, and a youngest daughter of 10 who had lost, inside 2 years, the sister who entertained her and the mother who had loved her from that careful. Terrible distance, and now would never be able to close it. It is often said of people who go on to do extraordinary things that you can find the engine of it in some early wound, and one should be careful with that kind of tidy storytelling, because a great many children suffer terrible losses and go on to live ordinary lives, and there is no law that says grief must be productive. But it is true at least that the 10-year-old Mania came out of those 2 years changed, more inward, more serious, prone to spells of a heavy grey sadness that would come and go for the rest of her long life, and also, and perhaps not separately, more fiercely, more single-mindedly, devoted to the one thing that could not be taken from her by fever or by the Russian authorities or by anyone, which was the inside of her own head. She was, everyone agreed, an alarming student. She had a memory that frightened her teachers, could read at 4, sat at the top of every class without visible effort, and won a gold medal on finishing secondary school at 15, and none of this brought her any nearer to the thing she actually wanted, because the thing she wanted was to go on, to study properly at a university, and the University of Warsaw, like every university in the Russian Empire, did not admit women. Full stop, no exceptions, and so the cleverest girl in the city, medal and all, walked out of school at 15 into a country that had, formally, no further use for her mind. What she did instead, in the first place, was rest, though rest is perhaps the wrong word for it. The grey sadness came down on her hard after she finished school, and her worried father sent her away for a year into the countryside to stay with relatives, uncles and cousins scattered on small estates in the south, and there, for very nearly the only extended stretch of her entire life, the most disciplined woman of her age did almost nothing at all. She went to country dances and stayed up till dawn, and wore out her shoes and rode in sleighs and picked strawberries and read novels instead of textbooks, and by her own later account was for once perfectly, uselessly happy, and it is worth lingering on this, because the woman we are following will spend nearly every remaining year of her life working to the edge of collapse, and it is good to know that there was 1 year in which she simply lived, and that she remembered it fondly, and that she knew even then that it was a holiday from her real nature, and would not come again. Then she went back to Warsaw, and the real nature reasserted itself. Because the universities were closed to them, the young educated Poles of Warsaw had built themselves a secret one. It moved from apartment to apartment to stay ahead of the Russian police. It met in the evenings behind curtained windows. Its lecturers were volunteers, and its students were mostly young women shut out of the official system, and it was known, half proudly and half as a joke, as the Flying University, because it was always in flight, always changing address. A whole clandestine institution, with no building and no charter and no legal right to exist, teaching biology and sociology and literature and the forbidden history of Poland to anyone brave enough and hungry enough to come. Mania and her sister Bronia both threw themselves into it, and it mattered to Mania in 2 ways at once. It gave her real learning at a level the girls' schools had not, and it wrapped that learning inside a cause, the quiet, stubborn survival of a nation that was not allowed to exist, and this fusion of study and patriotism and secrecy went deep into her and stayed there. She came to believe, and believed for the rest of her life, that knowledge was a form of resistance, that to learn a true thing and to keep it and to pass it on was a way of refusing to be erased, and this is not a small key to the woman she became. But the Flying University, thrilling as it was still not a degree, and a degree, a real one, could only be had abroad. in a country that would let a woman sit the examinations, and the nearest such country, the shining, impossible destination, was France, and the university at the heart of it was the Sorbonne in Paris. And Paris cost money, years of money, and the Sklodowski family did not have years of money. They barely had months of rent. And here the story arrives at one of its quietest and most beautiful hinges, an arrangement between two sisters that will decide everything. Bronya wanted to study medicine in Paris. Mania wanted to study science in Paris. Neither could afford to go, and certainly both could not go at once. So the two of them made a pact, sitting up talking it through, and the pact was this. Mania would not go first. Mania, the younger, would stay behind and take work as a governess, teaching other people's children in other people's houses. And she would send the money she earned to Paris to keep Bronya at her medical studies. And then, once Bronya had qualified as a doctor and begun to earn, the flow would reverse, and Bronya would send for Mania and support her through her own degree in turn. It was a bet on the future, made by two young women with nothing, and it required the younger and, as it happens, the more gifted of them to put her own dream in a drawer and close it and wait, for years, with no guarantee that the years would end, and to do it not resentfully but gladly, as her contribution, and she did. In the autumn of 1885 she took a post as a governess, and so began the long grey patient middle of her youth. The first position was a disaster, a household in Warsaw where she was treated coldly and spent unhappily, and she left it. The second was the one that marked her. It was far out in the countryside to the north, a place called Szuki, on the estate of a family named Zurawski, who ran a beet sugar operation, and there she went to live, a governess of 18, hundreds of miles from her father, to teach the daughters of the house their lessons. She did her work well. She taught the Zurawski children conscientiously, and then, in the hours that were her own, she did two other things that tell you exactly who she was. First, in secret and at some genuine risk, she started a little free evening school for the local peasant children, the sons and daughters of the estate workers, who under the Russian system were meant to remain illiterate. And she taught them to read and write in their own forbidden Polish language, by candlelight, without pay, because she had decided long ago that learning was a form of resistance, and here was a place to resist. And second, in the deep hours of the night when the house was quiet, she taught herself, out of whatever books she could beg or borrow, working through mathematics and physics and chemistry alone at a table by a lamp, with no teacher and no laboratory and no examinations to sit, and no promise that any of it would ever be of the slightest use, keeping her own mind alive on the chance that the pact with her sister would one day come good. It is an extraordinary picture, when you hold it still, the girl in the provincial manor teaching the poor to read by day and teaching herself the sciences by night, entirely on faith. And into the middle of this disciplined, self-denying, waiting life walked, as it tends to love, the eldest son of the house, a young man named Kazimierz Zurawski, came home from his own university studies, and he and the clever, grave, luminous governess fell for each other, genuinely and mutually, and they wished to marry. And his parents, who were fond enough of the governess as a governess, said no, absolutely and finally no. Because whatever her gifts, she was a poor girl, a hired teacher of their children, with no fortune and no land, and their son could and therefore must do better, and the young man, who loved her, did not defy them. He bowed to his family. And Mania, who had been ready to marry him, was left in the house that had rejected her, still employed by them, still teaching their younger children their lessons every single day, still passing the young man in the corridors, for months with the wound of it fresh, keeping her composure and doing her job, because she needed the wages for Paris, for Bronya, for the pact. It was one of the coldest, longest humiliations of her life, and she got through it the way she got through most things, by working and by waiting and by telling almost no one how much it hurt. Years later, and this is one of the small dry ironies the story hands us, that same young man, Casimir's, would grow up to be a distinguished professor of mathematics, and as an old man he would sit for long stretches on a bench in Warsaw in front of a statue of the world-famous scientist that the poor rejected governess had by then become, looking up at the likeness of the woman his family had not thought good enough. But that is far ahead. For now she simply endured it, sent her wages west, kept her secret school going, kept teaching herself physics in the dark, and waited for her sister to finish and for the world to turn. And at last, slowly, it turned. Bronia qualified as a physician in Paris. Bronia married a fellow doctor, a Polish exile, and set up a home and a practice there. And Bronia, keeping faith exactly, wrote to her younger sister and told her the drawer could be opened now. The waiting was done. Come to Paris, come and live with us, come and study at last. And still Mania hesitated, held back by guilt and by duty, and by her aging father, whom she did not want to leave, and by a lingering flicker of hope about the young man. And she let another year or more go by in Poland. But in the end, the pull of the thing she had wanted since she was a girl standing in front of her father's glass case of instruments was too strong, and in the autumn of 1891, at the age of 23, considerably older than the students she would sit among, Maria Skłodowska packed a folding chair and a mattress and some bedding and food to save money, and boarded a fourth-class carriage on the long, cold, days-long railway journey west, across the invisible border of the country that did not exist, through Germany, and on to France, to the city she had dreamed of for so long that it can hardly have felt real when the train finally slid into it under. Its great roof of iron and glass. She was in Paris, she was free, and she was, as she would shortly discover, going to be extremely cold and extremely hungry for quite some time. At first she stayed with Bronia and her doctor husband in their apartment in a bustling quarter of the city, and it was warm and kind and full of Polish talk and Polish visitors and the coming and going of patients, and it was, for a young woman who had come to Paris to do nothing on earth but study, entirely impossible. There was too much life in it. So after a little while she did the thing that was pure Maria, and moved out, away from comfort and company, into a series of cheap rented rooms of her own, up under the roofs of the Latin Quarter, within walking distance of the university, so that she could be cold and poor and undisturbed and completely gloriously free to work. And she was all four of those things. The garret rooms she took were the classic students' attics of the old city, a single small space at the top of many flights of stairs, with a sloping ceiling and one small window and no heating to speak of, and no light but a paraffin lamp, and no water that did not have to be carried up. In winter the water froze in its basin in the night. She had almost no money, only the thin trickle her father could send and what remained of her governess' savings, and she budgeted it to the last centime, and she economised, as poor students always have, on the two things that are easiest to economise on and worst to lose, which are warmth and food. She wore, indoors, every piece of clothing she owned at once, and piled her spare clothes and even her folding chair on top of the bedclothes at night for the weight and warmth of them. And she ate, for weeks at a stretch, almost nothing, buttered bread and tea, sometimes an egg, sometimes a piece of fruit, rarely any meat, cooking nothing, because cooking took time and money and attention she would rather spend on physics, until more than once she stood up too fast from her books and the room swam, and went white and she fainted clean away on the floor of the attic from simple hunger, and picked herself up, and had a little more bread, and went back to work, and did not mention it to her sister, who would have fussed and fed her and slowed her down. It sounds like misery, and in the body it must often have been, but she did not remember it as misery. She remembered these as some of the best years of her life, and one believes her because for the first time there was nothing at all between her and the work. No Russian inspectors, no children to teach, no household to run, no family to reassure, no pack to serve. Nothing but herself, and the lamp and the mathematics and the whole cathedral of French science open at last in front of her, and she went into it like a starving person into a feast, which physically she more or less was. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, the science faculty of the University of Paris, and she signed the register with the French form of her name, Marie. And it is from about here that we can begin to call her Marie, the name the world would keep. She arrived with the gaps you would expect of a young woman largely self-taught by lamplight in a provincial manner, her spoken French imperfect, her mathematics uneven, whole areas simply missing, and she set about closing every gap by main force, sitting in the front rows, taking everything down, going back to her cold room and reworking it all until it was solid. And she who had feared she was behind turned out, when the first examinations came in the summer of 1893, to have placed first, ahead of every French-born man in the cohort, in the licence in physical sciences, the equivalent of a master's degree in physics. First, the foreign girl who fainted from hunger in an attic and had learned half of it alone in the dark had come top of physics in Paris. She had by then run almost entirely out of money, and would have had to stop, but a scholarship from a Polish foundation, a small fund for gifted students to study abroad, reached her at exactly the right moment and carried her through a second year. And she used it to take a second degree, the licence in mathematics, and in the summer of 1894 she placed again, this time second, in mathematics, in the whole faculty. And here is the detail that tells you the size of her character better than any medal. Some years later, once she had begun to earn a little from her own scientific work, she quietly paid that Polish scholarship back, the whole sum, returned it to the fund so that it could be given to another poor student, even though it had been a gift and no one had ever asked for or expected repayment. She had simply decided that it was a loan she owed to the next person, and she paid it. Now she had 2 Paris degrees, first in one and second in the other, and a small growing reputation, and a commission to carry out a study of the magnetic properties of various steels for a French industrial society, which was real paid scientific work, and it came with a very ordinary practical problem. She needed laboratory space to do it in, benches and instruments and room to set up her samples, and she did not have any, and the cramped facilities she could get access to were not enough. And so a Polish physicist she knew, thinking to help, suggested that she call on a French colleague of his, a man with a laboratory of his own at a technical college, a serious and slightly unworldly scientist who might have space to spare and who would understand what she was trying to do. And that is how, early in the year 1894, in a friend's apartment, over the practical question of where a young woman might find a corner of a laboratory to measure the magnetism of steel, Marie Skłodowska was introduced to a tall, quiet, absent-minded, gentle-eyed man of 35 named Pierre Curie. He was, in his way, as unusual as she was. He came from a free-thinking, cultivated, unconventional Parisian family, the son of a doctor, and he had been educated not in the ordinary schools, but at home, by his father and a tutor, because as a boy his mind did not run along the tracks the schools laid down, dreamy and slow and deep rather than quick, and left to grow at its own pace it had grown into something formidable. He and his older brother, working together as very young men, had discovered an important physical effect in certain crystals, the way some crystals generate an electrical charge when they are squeezed, an effect still in use in the world today in countless devices, and Pierre had gone on to do fine work on magnetism and on the physics of crystals and symmetry, work good enough to have made him famous, had he been the sort of man who pursued fame, which he emphatically was not. He was, if anything, allergic to it. He held a modest, badly paid teaching post at a school of industrial physics and chemistry, in cramped quarters, with no proper laboratory of his own worth the name, partly because he had never troubled to push himself forward, never cultivated the powerful men, never played the long patient game of the French academic career, regarding all of that as a distraction from the only thing that interested him, which was understanding how nature actually worked. He was 35 and unmarried, and had more or less concluded that he would stay that way, having decided as a younger man, in a rather sweeping and melancholy way, that women of genius were rare, and that an ordinary marriage would only pull a scientist down into daily life and away from the work, and having therefore quietly given up on the whole enterprise of love. And then a Polish woman with grave eyes and reddened work-roughened hands and first place in physics walked into a friend's drawing room to ask about laboratory space and talk to him, seriously as an equal, about magnetism and crystals and the physics they both loved, and the sweeping, melancholy conclusion of his younger years fell over quietly like a chess piece knocked off a board. He was, quite simply, thunderstruck, though, being who he was, he showed it mostly by talking to her about physics for a very long time and then finding reasons to see her again. What drew them together was not, at least at first, romance in the ordinary storybook sense. It was recognition. Each of them had spent years assuming that no one else quite lived the way they lived, wholly inside the work, indifferent to money and comfort and status, happiest at a bench, and each of them had, without expecting to, found the one other person in the city who was exactly the same. He courted her in the only language he really trusted, sending her a copy of one of his own scientific papers, inscribed, and taking her to see his laboratory, and talking, endlessly, about the things that mattered to them both, and slowly the young woman who had sworn off love once already, badly, in a Polish manor house, and the older man who had sworn it off in principle, came round to the astonishing idea that they might, after all, be the exception to their own rules. There was one large obstacle, and it was Poland, because Marie did not, at first, mean to stay in France at all. Her plan, her long-held plan, the plan that had been the whole point, was to take her Paris degrees and her Paris training and go home, back to Warsaw, to her father, to her country, to teach and to work and to give what she had gained to the nation that was not allowed to exist. And Pierre Curie, a Frenchman rooted in Paris, was not part of that plan, and knew it. And so there was a long, tender, difficult tug between them, conducted partly by letter when she went back to Poland for a summer, in which he argued, gently, patiently, and with a certain quiet desperation, that she should stay, that they should build a life together, in the laboratory, and that the work they could do side by side mattered more than any border. He even offered, if it came to it, to give up France and come and live with her in Poland, to become, for her sake, a Polish schoolteacher, an offer that tells you exactly how far this undemonstrative man had fallen. In the end, it was not any single argument that decided it, but the slow accumulated weight of the recognition between them, and the plain fact that Warsaw, under the Russians, could offer her no laboratory and no future worthy of what she now was, while Paris and Pierre could offer her both, and so, at last, she said yes, and chose France, and chose him, and set the other life, the Polish teaching life she had always imagined, gently down and let it go. They were married on the 26th of July, in the year 1895, in the plainest possible way, in a civil ceremony at the town hall of the suburb where Pierre's parents lived, with no church, no white dress, no gold rings, no wedding feast, because neither of them had the slightest interest in any of that, and both of them thought it a waste of money that could buy apparatus. Marie wore a plain dark blue outfit, practical, something she could afterward wear in the laboratory, and did in fact wear in the laboratory for years. And for a honeymoon the two of them took a sum of money that some relatives had given them as a wedding present, and spent it on 2 bicycles, and rode off together into the French countryside for the summer, down the lanes and along the rivers, stopping where they liked, sleeping at village inns, botanizing and picnicking and talking, too grave. Happy, sunburned scientists on bicycles, and it is one of the sweetest pictures in the whole long life, and worth holding on to, because the life is about to become very hard, and very great, and in the end, very sad, and this bright bicycling summer is the threshold they cross to reach all of it. They set up house together in a small apartment, sparsely furnished on principle, with almost no chairs, because Marie had noticed that chairs only encouraged visitors to sit and stay and talk when there was work to be done, and they arranged their 2 lives around the laboratory the way other couples arrange theirs around a home. In the September of 1897 their first daughter was born, a girl they named Irene, and here the ordinary strain of every working mother in history arrives, made no easier by genius, because Marie had a doctorate to begin and a laboratory to get to, and now also an infant to feed and love, and she was torn badly between the child and the work, and she managed it the way she managed everything, by rigorous organisation, by help, and by a certain amount of quiet suffering. She kept careful notebooks of the baby's weight and her first teeth and her first words with the same exact hand she used for her scientific measurements, because that was simply how her mind recorded what it loved, and she was rescued practically by her father-in-law. Pierre's father, the old free-thinking doctor, by then a widower, came to live with the young family, and he took over a great deal of the daily care of little Irene, and adored her and raised her in his own gentle, sceptical, curious spirit, and this freed Marie to go back to the bench, and it is no small thing, when you are telling the story of how the work got done, to say plainly that it got done in part because a kind old man changed his granddaughter and walked her in the park so that her mother could go and change the world. Because now Marie needed a subject for her doctoral research, a real question, something new, and she went looking for one, and the thing she chose had only just appeared in the world, so new that almost no one had troubled to look into it, which was exactly why she chose it. A year or so before, in 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel had made a strange, almost accidental discovery. He had been studying the way certain minerals glow after being left in sunlight, and he had a compound of the heavy metal uranium, and he expected that it would need sunlight to make it active. But he found, more or less by luck, when a stretch of cloudy Parisian weather left his wrapped photographic plates and his uranium sitting together in a dark drawer for days with no sunlight at all, that when he developed the plates anyway, expecting nothing, they were fogged, exposed, marked, as if by light, in the dark, in the shape of the uranium sample. The uranium was giving off some kind of rays, all by itself, continuously, with no sunlight, no heating, no input of any kind, a faint, invisible radiation that came out of the metal endlessly and passed through the black paper and marked the plate. It was deeply peculiar, because it seemed to break a comfortable rule, the rule that you do not get something for nothing. That energy has to come from somewhere. Here was a lump of metal simply sitting on a shelf pouring out rays year after year with nothing going in. Becquerel had noticed it, reported it, and then, as scientists often do with a genuinely strange result that does not fit anything, more or less set it aside, because he did not know what to do with it, and the wider scientific world, dazzled just then by other new rays, the X-rays that had been found at almost the same moment, and that could photograph the bones inside a living hand, largely ignored the quiet uranium glow as a minor curiosity. Marie looked at that neglected curiosity and saw her doctorate, and, though neither she nor anyone else could have known it, saw the doorway to the whole rest of her life and to a new understanding of matter itself. She took as her question a very precise one. What exactly were these uranium rays? How strong were they? What affected them? And above all, was uranium the only substance in the world that gave them off? Or were there others? To answer it, she needed to measure the rays exactly, not just to see that a plate was fogged, but to put an actual number on how strongly a given sample radiated. And here Pierre and his brother's old discovery came into its own, because the delicate instruments Pierre had built years before, based on that electrical effect in squeezed crystals, could measure the tiny electrical currents that the rays produced in the air as they passed through it, and could measure them finally, repeatably, as numbers. So Marie set up in a cramped, damp, borrowed ground-floor storeroom at Pierre's school, cold and unglamorous, and began, sample by sample, with enormous patience, to measure the strength of the radiation from uranium and its compounds, and then, crucially, to test everything else she could lay her hands on. Every element and every mineral she could beg from the collections of Paris, one after another, to see whether anything besides uranium made the air conduct electricity in that same strange way. And out of these patient measurements came, quite quickly, her first two great insights, and they are the foundation of everything after. The first was this. She found, by measuring pure uranium and many different uranium compounds, that the strength of the radiation depended only on how much actual uranium was present, and on nothing else at all, not on whether it was in this chemical combination or that one, not on temperature, not on light, not on whether it was solid or dissolved, not on anything a chemist could do to it. The rays did not care about the chemistry, and this pointed to a conclusion so strange that it took real courage to state it plainly, that the radiation was not a chemical property, not something happening between atoms, but something happening inside the individual atom itself, coming from within the very atom of uranium, an atomic property, a thing the atom simply did, of itself, uncaused. From inside. This was, quietly, revolutionary, because the atom in those days was still imagined as the smallest, simplest, most changeless, most billiard ball-like thing there was, indivisible by definition, the very floor of matter. And here was a young woman's careful arithmetic suggesting that something was going on inside the atom, that the atom had an interior, an activity, a life. She gave the whole phenomenon a name, one she coined, and it is the word we still use. She called it radioactivity, the activity of giving off rays, and any substance that did it she called radioactive. The second insight came when she tested not just pure substances, but natural ores, rocks straight out of the ground, and she reached a particular black, heavy, tarry mineral, an ore of uranium called pitchblende, dug mostly from mines in a mountain region of Bohemia, and she measured it, and the number was wrong. The pitchblende was far more radioactive than it had any business being. She knew exactly how much uranium was in it, she could measure that, and she knew from all her other work exactly how much radiation that amount of uranium should produce, and the pitchblende was pouring out several times more radiation than its uranium could possibly account for, as if there were far more uranium in it than there actually was, which was impossible. She checked and rechecked, because a careful scientist distrusts a startling result most of all, and the discrepancy held. And then she made the leap that turns a good measurement into a discovery. She reasoned that if the ore was more radioactive than its uranium could explain, then there must be something else in it, some other substance, mixed into the black rock in tiny quantities, some new element that no one had ever isolated or named, and that this unknown thing must be enormously ferociously radioactive, far more so than uranium itself, to make so large a difference while present in so small an amount. A new element, hidden in the rock. Announcing itself only by the strength of its invisible rays, it was a thrilling and slightly outrageous claim to make on the strength of an electrical measurement, and it is the moment the work stopped being a doctoral exercise and became something enormous. And here the story gains its second scientist, because Pierre Curie, watching his wife's measurements pile up and grasping at once how big this was, set aside his own research, his crystals and his symmetries, the work of his whole career, and came to join her at the bench, not as the senior man directing a junior, but as an equal partner, throwing his weight behind the more important thing. And for the next years the two of them worked as very nearly a single mind, so closely that in their notebooks the two handwritings alternate on the same page in the middle of the same experiment. Together, through the year 1898, they hunted the hidden element by a method as laborious as it was clever. They took the pitchblende and dissolved it and separated it chemically, step by step, into its different constituents, and after each separation they did not ask, as a chemist normally would, which part smells or looks or weighs like something. They asked only which part was radioactive, letting the invisible rays themselves be the guide, following the radioactivity down through the chemistry like a scent, discarding whatever fractions were quiet and keeping and further dividing whatever fractions were active. And the radioactivity did not stay in one place. It split. It led them, that year, not to one new element, but to two. The first they cornered in the summer of 1898, a new element that followed the chemistry of bismuth and was hundreds of times more radioactive than uranium, and Marie, given the honour of naming it, and never for one moment forgetting the country that did not exist, called it polonium, after Poland, so that the name of her erased homeland would be written permanently into the periodic table of the elements of the universe, a small fierce act of patriotism disguised as chemistry. And then, chasing the radioactivity into another fraction entirely, the one that followed the chemistry of barium, they found signs of a second new element, one that glowed even more strongly than polonium, astonishingly, almost unbelievably radioactive. And this one. At the very end of the year 1898, they announced and named radium, from the Latin word for ray, the ray-giving thing, the shining thing. They had on paper discovered 2 new elements in a single year, purely by chasing invisible rays through black rock. There was only one problem, and it was the problem that would consume the next 4 years of their lives. They had found these elements, detected them, measured them, named them, but they had not actually got them. Not really. Not in the way a chemist means it. They had never held any pure polonium or pure radium, never seen it, never weighed a visible speck of it, never proven to the skeptics that it was truly a new element rather than some mistake or some odd behaviour of the known ones. All they had was the radioactivity, the rays, the numbers. And the old guard of chemistry, quite reasonably by the standards of the day, wanted more than rays. Show us the element, they said in effect. Give us a sample we can put on the table. Weigh, hold, measure its atomic weight, list in the book. And so the Curies, to prove that the thing they had discovered was real, set themselves the almost inhuman task of extracting, from tons of raw black ore, by hand, enough pure radium to weigh, and for that they needed the shed. This is the shed we began with tonight, and now we have arrived at it honestly, from the far side of a childhood and a country and a marriage, and we can stand in it and understand what was happening. The school where Pierre taught could give the Curies no proper laboratory for such an undertaking, nothing remotely adequate, and so what they were given, grudgingly, was the use of an abandoned wooden shed in a courtyard across from Pierre's classrooms, a disused dissecting room that the medical faculty had once used and given up as unfit even for cutting up cadavers. It had a leaking glass roof that let the rain through, a bare beaten earth floor, no proper ventilation, no fume hoods to draw off the acrid gases of their chemistry, and one worn-out cast-iron stove that stood in a corner and did almost nothing against the cold, so that in winter the temperature inside sank near to freezing, and in summer the glass roof turned the place into an oven. A visiting German chemist of real distinction, coming to see the famous radium work he had heard about, is said to have looked around the shabby shed and, finding it empty of people, assumed he had come to the wrong address entirely, because no one could possibly be doing important science in a place like that. But they were. For close to 4 years, from 1898 to 1902, the Curies worked in that shed, and the work was not the delicate glassware and tweezers science of the popular imagination. It was heavy industrial labour, filthy and endless, carried out by 2 people with almost no help. They had arranged cleverly to get their raw material cheap. They did not need the uranium in the pitch blend, only the tiny trace of radium hidden with it, so they obtained from a mine and ore processing works in Bohemia tons, literally tons, of the residue left over after the valuable uranium had already been extracted for use in colouring glass and ceramics, the spent brown waste that the works would otherwise have thrown away. And this waste, still full of their radium, came to Paris by the sackload and by the wagon-load and was piled in the courtyard, and from it, a bucket at a time, they had to extract. In the end, from many tons of rock, a quantity of pure radium so small it could sit on the tip of a finger. The process was brutal in its sheer scale. The ore had to be broken up, and boiled, and dissolved in acid, and filtered, and precipitated, and boiled again, and separated, and crystallized, and recrystallized, over and over and over, each cycle concentrating the radium a little further and throwing away a great mass of useless material, and every stage had to be done on a large scale to have any hope of ending with a weighable amount, which meant handling great steaming vats of caustic, boiling liquid. And it fell out, between the 2 of them, that the physically enormous part, the part that meant standing for whole days over a boiling cauldron nearly as big as herself, stirring the seething mass with a heavy iron rod to keep it from settling, breathing the fumes, her eyes stinging, her hands cracked and stained and burned, went largely to Marie, the smaller and the slighter of the two, while Pierre took the finer, more delicate final stages of measurement and analysis. And so it is a plain and slightly astonishing fact that the woman doing the heaviest manual labour in that yard, hauling and pouring and stirring pitchblende by the ton, season after season, was a young mother of not much more than 100 pounds, who was at that very time also the most important physicist working anywhere in the world on the newest question in science. She did it in her plain dark laboratory dress, the same practical dark blue she had worn to be married in, and she did it happily. That is the part that is hardest to convey and most worth conveying. By every measure of comfort, those shed years were wretched, cold, poor, exhausting, physically damaging in ways they did not yet understand, and the Curies remembered them, both of them, ever afterward, as the happiest and best years of their lives, the heroic years, the years when they were young and together and poor and free and on the trail of something magnificent, working side by side in their bare kingdom with no one watching and no one interfering, walking home tired in the evening to their small child and their spare apartment, and going back the next morning to the shed. They fell into the habit, on some evenings, of returning to the shed after dinner, not to work but simply to look, because as the radium in their jars and dishes grew more and more concentrated, it began to do something visible, something no one had ever had enough of a radioactive substance in one place to see before. It glowed. The little glass vessels and dishes of concentrated radium salts, ranged on the shelves and on the benches in the dark shed, gave off of themselves in the pitch blackness a faint, eerie bluish-green light, a soft luminosity that needed no lamp and no flame and never went out and never cooled. A cold, living glow that hung in the darkness wherever the radium was. And the two of them used to go and stand in the doorway of the black shed in the evening and simply look at it, at their shelves full of faintly shining tubes floating in the dark like something out of a fairy tale, and it is, in the whole hard history of the work, the one purely magical image. And they treasured it, and Marie wrote of it long afterward, with real tenderness. The glowing tubes that were the visible sign that they had been right. What they did not know, what no one on earth yet knew, was that the beautiful glow was also slowly killing them. The radiation they were bathing in daily, hour after hour, year after year, with no shielding of any kind, handling the glowing salts with their bare fingers, carrying tubes of it around in their pockets to show people, keeping a little by the bed because they liked to look at it, was quietly damaging the living cells of their bodies in ways that would take years and decades to come fully due, but that had already begun. Their fingertips grew hardened, cracked, and numb, and slow to heal. They were tired in a way that never quite lifted. They ached. They put it down to the hard work and the cold and the fumes, as anyone would, and went on. Because the danger of radioactivity to the human body was itself a thing that had not yet been discovered, and would, in a grim irony that runs all the way through this life, be learned largely from what happened to the very people, these two above all, who first worked with it. But that reckoning was for later. In the shed, in those years there was only the glow and the work and the slow, agonizing, thrilling approach to the goal. And at last, in the year 1902, after processing something on the order of a ton of pitchblende residue with her own hands, Marie reached the end of the road she had set herself. She succeeded in preparing a pure compound of radium, a tiny sample of a radium salt, about 1/10 of a gram of it, a speck, a pinch, a barely visible quantity gathered from that mountain of rock. And it was enough, at last, to do the thing the septics had demanded. She could weigh it. She could measure, from that pure sample, the atomic weight of radium, the fundamental number that every true element has, and that pins it forever into its proper place in the great ordered table of the elements. And she measured it, carefully. And there it was. A new number. a new element's own signature. Undeniable. Radium was real. It was not a mistake, not an artifact, not the misbehavior of some known substance. It was a genuine new element, the 88th, and she had wrenched it out of the earth by main force and pinned it down in numbers, and no chemist in the world could argue any longer. The thing she had guessed at from an anomalous electrical reading 4 years before, she now held, weighed, and named in the palm of her hand, faintly glowing. It is worth pausing, in the quiet of the shed, on the size of what had just been done, and by whom. A poor girl from an occupied country that did not appear on the map, shut out of every university at home, who had taught herself physics by lamplight while sending her wages to her sister, who had come to Paris and fainted from hunger in an attic, and come first in the examinations anyway, had, with her husband, discovered 2 new elements, coined the word radioactivity, shown that the atom itself had an inner life and could pour out energy from within, and had proved it all by extracting a shining speck of a new element from a ton of black rock with her own cracked and stained hands in a freezing leaky shed that a German professor had mistaken for the wrong building. And she did it, and this is the part she cared most about. Without patenting any of it, she and Pierre took a clear and deliberate decision, discussed and agreed between them, that they would not patent the process for extracting radium, would not try to own it or to grow rich from it, even though radium was already becoming valuable and they were themselves still poor, because they believed that scientific knowledge belonged to the world and to whoever could use it, especially. As it turned out, to the doctors who were beginning to find that the rays of radium could burn away certain cancers, and that to lock it up behind a patent for their own profit would be a betrayal of what science was for. They gave it away, the whole method, freely to anyone who asked, and stayed poor a while longer for the sake of the principle, and never, either of them, expressed the smallest regret about it. That decision, as much as any measurement, is the measure of them. With the pure radium prepared and its atomic weight measured, Marie at last had a completed body of work grand enough for her doctorate, and in the summer of 1903 she presented it, defending her thesis on radioactive substances before a committee of the University of Paris, becoming the first woman in France ever to earn a doctorate in the physical sciences, and the examiners, 3 senior men who had themselves done distinguished work, said afterward, in effect, that her thesis represented the greatest single contribution to science ever made by a doctoral dissertation, which is not a thing examiners are much given to saying. She was by now a doctor of science, and quietly, among the small world of physicists who understood what she and Pierre had done, she was already famous. But the enormous, disfiguring, public sort of fame, the kind that would follow her for the rest of her life, and that she would never once enjoy, arrived at the end of that same year. In the autumn of 1903, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, one of the new and already immensely prestigious international prizes established only 2 years before out of the fortune of the Swedish inventor of dynamite, for the work on radioactivity. And here the story brushes up against the plain ugly fact of how the world was arranged in that year, because the prize was very nearly given to Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel alone, to the 2 men leaving Marie, whose measurements and whose insight and whose hands had been at the very centre of everything, off the award entirely, as though she had been an assistant. What saved her recognition was partly a sympathetic mathematician on the nominating side who alerted Pierre to what was happening, and above all Pierre himself, who wrote to the Swedish Academy and made it quietly, firmly clear that the work on radioactivity was his wife's as much as his, that it was inconceivable for the prize to be given for that work without her name on it, and that if she were excluded he would regard the honour as only half just. And so the Academy amended its decision, and the Nobel Prize in Physics for 1903 was divided, one half to Henri Becquerel for discovering the rays, the other half shared between Pierre Curie and Marie Curie for their study of them, and with that, Marie Curie became the first woman in the history of the world to win a Nobel Prize, a fact that would eventually be printed under her name in every schoolbook, though at the time she was too unwell and too indifferent to the whole business to travel to Sweden to collect it, and the Curies did not go to the ceremony at all that winter, pleading their teaching duties and their poor health, and only made the journey a year and a half later. The prize changed their circumstances and did not change their nature, and the gap between those two things is much of the texture of the next years. The money mattered, honestly and practically. The prize came with a substantial sum, and for two people who had been genuinely poor for their entire adult lives, who had done their greatest work in a freezing shed because they could afford nothing better, it meant, at last, a little air. They could pay off small debts. Marie could hire a laboratory assistant so that she was no longer doing every last thing herself. Pierre could, for the first time, give up some of the exhausting extra teaching he had taken on merely to make ends meet. They installed a modern bathroom in their apartment, a real luxury. But the fame that came with the money they experienced almost entirely as an affliction. Overnight, the shy, work-absorbed, privacy-loving Curies were the most famous scientists on Earth, and the world descended on them. Journalists came, and photographers, and the curious, and the autograph hunters, and the cranks, and people who wanted money, and people who wanted to name things after them, and the newspapers ran story after story, and much of the attention, in a way that was wearily familiar to Marie, and would be for the rest of her life, fastened on her not as a physicist but as a curiosity, a woman, a wife, a mother, who had somehow also done this, endlessly remarking on her sex as though it were the interesting thing about the discovery of a new element. Their work suffered. It became almost impossible to get anything quiet done. Pierre, who hated it even more than she did if that were possible, complained that the two of them no longer had a moment of peace, that he could not think, that the fame was pure loss, robbing them of the only thing they had ever wanted, which was to be left alone at a bench. They received a flood of invitations and honours and requests to travel and speak, most of which they declined, and running underneath the nuisance of it all was the world's sudden infatuation with radium itself, which became in those years a genuine popular craze, wildly out of proportion to anything sensible. Because radium glowed, because it seemed to pour out energy endlessly from nothing, because it was rare and new and mysterious, and its discoverers were famous and romantic, radium became a kind of magic word, and unscrupulous manufacturers with no restraint whatever and no knowledge of the danger began putting it, or claiming to put it, into everything they could sell. There was radium water sold as a health tonic, and radium toothpaste that promised a brighter smile, and radium face cream promised to restore youth, and radium chocolate, and radium suppositories, and glowing radium paint, and radium was advertised as a cure-all, a source of energy and vigour and health, precisely because it was so powerful when its power was in truth exactly the thing that made it deadly. The Curies knew radium could burn. They had the sores and scars on their own hands to prove it, and they knew it could destroy tissue. That indeed was the basis of the one genuinely useful medical application then emerging, the careful use of radium to burn away tumours, a treatment that came to be called Curie in some countries in their honour. But the wider recklessness of the radium craze, the tonics and the creams, ran far ahead of any real knowledge of the dangers, and a bill would eventually come due for a great many people, most tragically for the young women in later years, who painted glowing radium numbers onto watch dials and pointed their brushes with their lips, and who sickened and died of it. All of that lay in the future, gathering, while the world in the first years of the new century simply delighted in the wonderful shining stuff and in the shy famous couple who had found it. Amid the noise, ordinary life went on and brought its gifts. In the December of 1904 the Curies had their second child, another daughter, whom they named Eve, born now into a household that was famous and a little less poor than the one her elder sister had entered, and the two girls, Irene and Eve, would grow into strikingly different women, the elder grave and scientific and quiet, so like her mother that she would one day walk almost exactly in her footsteps, the younger artistic and worldly and warm, a musician and a writer, who would in time give the world the loving portrait of her mother that much of this story ultimately rests on. Marie now had two daughters, a Nobel Prize, a doctorate, a laboratory, and, at last, a slightly easier material life. And Pierre, whose long neglect by the French establishment had begun at last to be repaired by all the fame, was finally, belatedly, given a proper professorship at the Sorbonne, with the promise, important to them both, of a real laboratory to be built, the decent working space they had never in all their years together actually had. Marie was made the head of that laboratory. For a moment, in the year 1905 and into 1906, after all the cold sheds and the hunger and the labour, the arc of the life seemed to be bending, finally toward light and ease, toward good work done in warm rooms with enough help and enough money, and the whole of a long partnership still ahead of them, the two of them not yet 50 and 50, with their daughters and their radium and their plans. And it is exactly here, at this one bright landing on the long stair, with everything at last arranged for happiness, that the story breaks in half. It broke on an ordinary grey rainy Thursday in Paris, the 19th of April, in the year 1906. Pierre had spent the day at a lunch and a meeting, and in the afternoon in the rain. On a crowded narrow street on the left bank near the river, hurrying, distracted, holding his umbrella against the downpour, absent-minded as he had been all his life, he stepped out to cross the busy roadway, the Rue Dauphine, from behind a cab into the traffic, and slipped on the wet cobbles, and fell, directly into the path of a heavy horse-drawn wagon, an enormous dray loaded with military uniforms drawn by two great horses. The horses, it seems, he managed to avoid, or they to avoid him, but he went down under the wheels, and one of the huge rear wheels of the loaded wagon passed over his head, and killed him, instantly, there in the rain in the street, the gentle dreaming mind that had helped open the atom snuffed out in a moment by a cart. At the age of 46, it was, in its suddenness and its sheer stupid randomness, the cruellest kind of loss. No illness, no warning, no chance to say anything. A man simply going about an ordinary wet afternoon, and then gone. And the news was brought to Marie at home later that day, and the woman who had endured cold and hunger and rejection and grinding labour without complaint for her whole life was, by this, for a time, very nearly destroyed. She went silent. She would not weep in front of others. She wrote. In the private journal she began to keep and address directly to her dead husband a long, plain, unbearable account of those first days, of being told, of going to identify him, of his poor broken head, of the emptiness of the apartment, of speaking to him on the page because she could no longer speak to him anywhere else, and it is some of the most quietly heartbroken writing a scientist ever left behind. She was 38 years old, with two little girls, one of them a baby, and the other half of the single mind she had worked as for a decade was gone, and the whole shape of the life they had built together, the shared bench, the alternating handwriting, the evening walks to look at the glowing tubes, was ended in an instant on a rainy street, and she had to decide, in the wreckage, what a person does now. What she did was work, because it was the only floor left under her feet. Within weeks of Pierre's death, the University of Paris had to decide what to do with the professorship it had so recently given him, the chair and the laboratory that were to have been the reward for all the lean years, and after some hesitation, it did a thing that had never been done before in the 6.5 centuries of the Sorbonne. It offered the chair to his widow. It asked Marie Curie to take over her husband's professorship, and with it the directorship of the laboratory, and in doing so made her the first woman ever to teach as a professor at the University of Paris, the first woman to hold such a post in the whole long male history of the place. She accepted, not out of ambition, of which she had little, but because the work was Pierre's and now it was hers to carry, and because two daughters had to be fed, and because there was, quite simply, nothing else she knew how to do with grief, except to pour it into the thing they had built together. Her first lecture as a professor, some months after his death, was an event. The hall was packed, not only with students but with the curious and the fashionable and the press, everyone come to see the famous widow, the woman professor, the tragic figure, take the platform. and she came in, plainly dressed, pale and composed, and she did not make a speech about herself or about Pierre or about the historic nature of the moment. Did not acknowledge any of it. She opened her notes and began to lecture on the physics of radioactivity, picking up the subject at precisely the sentence, the very point in the material, where her husband's final lecture had left off, as though continuing a conversation only briefly interrupted, and having done that, she taught her class and left. It was the most eloquent thing she could possibly have done, and it was entirely characteristic. The years that followed were grey and full and lonely. She moved the household to a quieter suburb, partly for the girls, and she raised her 2 daughters largely alone, with the help of Polish governesses and her husband's family, and always her own iron routine. She fretted, as scientific parents sometimes do, that the ordinary French schools were both too cramming and too idle at once, and so for a couple of years she organised, with a small circle of her distinguished professor friends, a private cooperative school for their children, a kind of teaching commune in which each eminent parent taught the little band of children the subject he or she knew best, so that Marie herself taught them elementary physics through simple experiments, hands-on, letting them find things out, and a great mathematician taught them mathematics, and a famous scholar taught them literature, and the children got, for a while, the most extraordinary education in Europe, from some of its finest minds, before the practical difficulties wound it down. She went on with her science, steadily deepening the work, preparing measurement standards for radium so precise that they became the international reference, training a growing school of students and researchers who came from many countries to learn radioactivity from its source. And she was, in this period, honoured and celebrated abroad, and never quite accepted at home by the French establishment. A distinction that would sting sharply in the year 1911, twice. The first sting came at the beginning of that year, when Marie allowed her name to be put forward for election to the French Academy of Sciences, the ancient and glorious and self-satisfied summit of French science, which in all its history had never admitted a woman to its ranks. She was, on any honest scientific measure, more distinguished than almost every man already sitting in it. A Nobel laureate, the discoverer of 2 elements, the world authority on radioactivity, and her election ought to have been a formality. Instead, it became an ugly public battle, fought in the newspapers, in which a coalition of conservative and nationalist and frankly prejudiced opinion mobilised against her, on the grounds, variously, that she was a woman, that women did not belong in the academy, that she was a foreigner, a Pole, and, in the nastier corners of the press, on darker insinuations still. And when the vote was finally held, the Academy rejected her, narrowly, choosing a now-forgotten man over her, and slamming its door, and it would be more than 3 decades and long after her death before that body admitted a woman at last. She never put herself forward for it again. And then, later in that same wounding year, the second and far more personal storm broke, the one genuine scandal of her private life, and it must be told plainly and kindly, as this channel tells everything. In the years after Pierre's death, Marie, a widow in her early 40s, formed a close attachment to a fellow physicist, a former student of Pierre's named Paul Langevin, a brilliant man, and married, and unhappily so, long estranged from a wife, with whom he was on bitter terms. Marie and Langevin grew close, and the relationship became, for a time, an intimate one, 2 lonely people of the same world drawn together. It was, by the standards of respectable opinion of the day, an affair, he being still legally married, and when his wife discovered it she was enraged, and in the autumn of 1911 the whole thing was blown open, in the most humiliating possible way, when private letters between Marie and Langevin were obtained and handed to the newspapers and published. And the gutter press of Paris fell upon the story with savage glee. And the fury came down almost entirely on her, not on him. He was a man, and men strayed, and it was shrugged at. She was the famous woman, the foreigner, the Pole, and now, the papers screamed, a home-wrecker, a seductress, a foreign woman who had come to France and taken a French wife's husband, and the same nationalist press that had blocked her from the Academy now had its knives out in earnest, and there were crowds outside her house, and threats, and she was advised for her safety and her daughter's to leave home and stay elsewhere. It was as low and cruel a public shaming as could be arranged, and it broke her health, brought on a deep collapse, a severe depression, and a serious kidney illness that would trouble her for years. And it was into the very middle of this squalid, screaming, deeply unjust storm, with her name being dragged through the Paris mud, that the news arrived from Sweden that she had won the Nobel Prize a second time. For the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, that November of 1911, awarded her the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, this time to her alone, and not for the shared old physics, but specifically for her own chemical work, for the discovery of the elements polonium and radium, for isolating pure radium and determining its nature and its place among the elements. With it, she became the first person of any kind, man or woman, ever to be awarded 2 Nobel Prizes, and to this day she remains the only person ever to win the Nobel in 2 different sciences, physics and chemistry both, a distinction no one else has matched in more than a century. And the timing of it, set against the scandal, produced one last piece of ugliness that is worth recording, because it shows so clearly what she was up against. As she prepared this time, actually to travel to Stockholm to accept the prize in person, a senior figure connected to the Nobel institutions wrote to her, in effect, suggesting that in view of the scandal in the newspapers, she might do better not to come, to stay away from the ceremony, to spare everyone embarrassment until her private affairs were cleared up. And Marie Curie, ill, exhausted, publicly shamed, at the lowest ebb of her whole life, wrote back and refused. She replied in substance that the prize had been given for her scientific work, that there was no connection whatever between her scientific work and her private life, that she could not accept the principle that a discovery in chemistry could be tarnished by gossip about her personal conduct, and that she intended to come and receive the prize she had earned. And she went. Sick as she was, she made the winter journey to Stockholm, with her sister Bronya and her elder daughter beside her, and she stood before the Swedish king and the assembled academy and delivered the formal Nobel lecture on radium and the new chemistry of radioactivity, and accepted her second prize with her head up in the same season that the mob was howling outside her house in Paris. And it is, of all the images in this long life, perhaps the one that best captures the particular steel of the woman, that she would not let them take the work away from her, not the shed, not the fame, not the grief, and not the scandal. The work was hers, and she would answer for the work, and for nothing else. After Stockholm she came home and collapsed in earnest, and spent much of the next year or more gravely ill, out of the public eye, recovering slowly in seclusion and abroad under an assumed name to escape the press. Her body wrecked by the strain and by the kidney disease, and, though still no one fully understood this, by the years of radiation as well. It seemed for a while that the double blow of the Academy's rejection and the Langevin scandal might have finished her public life, that the world had, in its way, succeeded in driving her out. It had not. She recovered, slowly, and gathered herself, and turned back as always to the one thing that never betrayed her, the work, and to a great new project that would consume the last third of her life, the building, at last in Paris, of a true and proper temple to the science she had founded, a dedicated radium institute where radioactivity could be studied and where its healing uses against cancer could be developed, a real laboratory, warm and equipped and permanent, the exact opposite of the leaking shed. And it was being finished, its walls going up, its rooms being fitted out, in the summer of 1914, when the whole of Europe walked off a cliff into the First World War. When the war came in the August of 1914, and the German armies drove deep into France and came within a short march of Paris itself, so that the government fled south and the capital braced to be besieged, Marie Curie's first thought was for her radium. She had in the laboratory the single most precious and hard 1 gram of material in the world, the pure radium that had cost years of labour to extract, worth a fortune and irreplaceable, and rather than let it fall into enemy hands, she personally carried it, packed in its heavy lead shielding, by train to the city of Bordeaux where the government had taken refuge, and saw it locked away in a bank vault for safekeeping, and then, her treasure secured, she turned around and went straight back to the threatened capital, because she had decided that she was not going to spend this war guarding a gram of metal. She was going to spend it saving lives, and she had seen, with her physicist's eye, exactly how she could. The new X-rays, discovered at almost the same moment as radioactivity, could photograph the inside of a living body, could show the bones, and crucially for a war, could show the bullets and the shell splinters buried in a wounded man's flesh, the shrapnel and the broken bone that a surgeon otherwise had to hunt for blindly with his fingers, causing agony and often killing the patient in the search. If a surgeon at the front could see, before he cut, exactly where the metal was and how deep, he could operate faster and more surely and save limbs and lives that would otherwise be lost. The trouble was that the X-ray machines of the day were large and delicate and lived in hospitals, in cities, far behind the lines, while the wounded were dying at casualty stations near the front, too broken to be moved the long distance to where the machines were. And Marie Curie looked at that problem and conceived, and then with astonishing speed actually built, the solution, which was to bring the machine to the man. She would put X-ray equipment into motor cars. She would build mobile radiography units, ordinary vehicles fitted out with an X-ray apparatus and a dynamo driven by the car's own engine to generate the electricity, so that the whole thing could be driven right up to a field hospital near the fighting, parked, connected and used that same hour to photograph the wounded where they lay. It was a brilliant, practical, life-saving idea, and she threw the entire force of her formidable will and her fame behind making it real, at speed, in wartime. She begged and borrowed vehicles from wealthy acquaintances and from anyone who would give one ordinary touring cars and vans, and had them converted. She raised money, badgered manufacturers for equipment, stripped apparatus out of laboratories, and assembled the units one by one. And because there were nowhere near enough trained people to operate them, she trained them herself, and she trained herself first, learning in a hurry the practical medical radiography and the human anatomy she would need, and even learning to drive a motor car, no small thing for a woman of her age in that era, and to carry out the running repairs and change the tyres that the rough roads demanded, so that she could take a unit to the front and operate it with her own hands, which she did, repeatedly, driving to the battle zones, setting up in the mud, and radiographing the wounded through long days and nights. The little converted vehicles became known, affectionately, to the soldiers and the medical staff as the petites Curies, the little Curies, and there came to be about 20 of them, along with some 200 fixed radiological posts that she also equipped and organised in the field hospitals, and together over the course of the war, this radiological service that one woman had essentially invented and built and run is estimated to have X-rayed well over 1 million wounded soldiers. More than 1 million men whose surgeons could now see the metal before they cut, an almost unimaginable amount of suffering shortened and life saved by physics in vans. And she did not do it alone. Her elder daughter Irene, who was only 17 when the war began, joined her mother in the work as soon as she was old enough, went to the front with her, trained others, operated the equipment herself, and grew up, in those grim years amid the wounded, into exactly the calm, competent scientist her mother already was, so that the war that took so much also, quietly, handed the mother the beginnings of her scientific successor, the two of them working side by side over the shattered bodies of young men in field hospitals near the guns, mother and daughter. In a strange echo of Marie and Pierre over the boiling pitch blend, the family way of working reasserting itself in the worst of times. Marie also put her radium itself to work for the wounded and the sick. From the precious radium she collected the radioactive gas it constantly gives off, a gas then called radium emanation and known now as radon, and sealed it into tiny thin glass tubes, little needles of radioactivity which were distributed to hospitals to be used in the careful treatment of damaged tissue and disease, an early form of the radiation therapy against cancer that her discoveries had made possible and that saves so many lives today. She worked through the entire war at this pace, driving, training, organising, fundraising, exposing herself, it must be said, to still more radiation on top of all the years of it already in her body, and she asked for nothing in return, and indeed in a gesture that is almost unbelievable and entirely in character. When the war began, she had gone to offer her 2 Nobel Prize medals, the actual gold medals, to be melted down for the war effort, to turn her honours literally into money for France, and was gently refused by the bank official who could not bring himself to destroy them, whereupon she took the prize money she still had and bought war bonds with it instead, sinking her own savings into the French cause, most of which she never got back. This is the same woman, remember, whom a section of the French press had, 3 years earlier, been screaming at as a foreign homewrecker who did not belong in France. She answered them as she answered everything, not with words but with work, by giving that same France, in its hour of greatest need, her radium, her savings, her medals, her daughter, and years of her own failing health, driving X-ray vans through the mud to save the lives of French soldiers, and saying nothing about it. When the war ended at last, in the November of 1918, it ended with, among its countless larger consequences, the resurrection of her homeland. Out of the wreckage of the 3 empires that had carved up and swallowed Poland more than a century before, all 3 of them defeated or collapsed by the war's end, an independent Polish nation rose again and took its place on the map for the first time in 123 years. The country that had not officially existed for the whole of Marie's life until that moment suddenly, astonishingly existing again, and one can only imagine what it meant to the woman who had learned her physics in secret in an occupied Warsaw, and who had named a new element polonium precisely so that Poland's name would live somewhere, to see the real Poland itself return to life in her own lifetime. She was, by then, an aging, ailing, world-famous widow of 51. Greyer, thinner, her fingertips scarred, her ears ringing, her eyes beginning to cloud with the cataracts that the radiation was growing in them, her body carrying the accumulated damage of 20 years of the glowing work. And she came out of the war into a strange new phase of her life, the last long phase, in which the shy woman who had wanted nothing but to be left alone at a bench found herself transformed, whether she liked it or not, into something she had never sought to be and never fully believed in, a monument, a living legend, the most famous woman of science in the history of the world, and had to learn in her tired last years how to spend that fame, reluctantly, for the good of the work she would leave behind. The great problem of her last years, the thing she spent her reluctant fame to solve, was radium itself, or rather the lack of it. Her Radium Institute in Paris had been finished during the war, and now, in peace, it began to grow into the world centre for the study of radioactivity that she had always dreamed of, filling with students and researchers from every country, doing fine work, developing the treatment of cancer by radiation, and it had, at its heart, one crippling shortage. It had almost no radium. Radium was by then staggeringly expensive, worth many times its weight in gold, because it was so fantastically hard to extract, and Marie Curie, who had discovered it, isolated it, named it, given away the process for free, and used it to save 1 million wounded men, personally owned barely more than a single gram of it, which she needed for her research, and could not begin to afford to buy the more that her institute required to do its work and to make more of the healing radon tubes. The discoverer of radium could not afford radium. It was an absurd and rather bitter situation, and it was solved unexpectedly by America, through the persistence of one determined American woman. An American journalist and magazine editor named Mrs. William Brown Maloney, a small, half-crippled, immensely capable woman who idolized Marie Curie, managed after long effort to obtain an interview with her, and was struck to the heart to learn that the great scientist, whose discovery had by then made other people rich and cured or comforted many thousands of the sick, was herself so poor in the very substance she had given the world, that her laboratory was starved of it. Mrs. Maloney went home to the United States and resolved to fix this, and she launched a public campaign, a national appeal, chiefly to the women of America, to raise the enormous sum, more than $100,000, needed to buy a single gram of pure radium and give it to Marie Curie for her research. The campaign caught fire. Ordinary American women in their thousands, in schools and clubs and church groups and small towns all across the country, gave what they could, $1 here and $1 there, and within a year the money was raised. The gram of radium was purchased, and Marie Curie was invited to come to the United States in person in the spring of 1921 to receive it as the gift of the women of America. She did not want to go. She dreaded the crossing, the crowds, the noise, the endless public appearances, everything her nature recoiled from. But she understood the size of the gift and the debt of gratitude it laid on her, and she understood too shrewdly that this famous journey could be turned to the further good of her institute, and so she steeled herself and went, taking both her daughters with her, the grave Irene and the lively Eve, and crossed the Atlantic, and was met in America by a reception on a scale she had never imagined, mobbed by crowds and reporters, cheered through the streets, given honorary degrees by one university after another, feted at banquets, worn nearly to collapse by the punishing schedule of adulation. This frail, shy, plainly dressed widow in her worn dark dress, moving like a slightly bewildered saint through the roaring enthusiasm of a whole nation. The climax came in Washington, at the White House, where the President of the United States, Warren Harding, in a formal ceremony, presented her with the radium, or rather, in a nice touch, with a symbolic golden key to the lead-lined casket that held it, the actual gram being too dangerous and too precious to hand across a room, and made a speech in her honour before the assembled dignitaries, praising her not only as a scientist, but as a woman and a mother, the whole country pouring its admiration over the discoverer of radium. And Marie, characteristically, had done one quiet, exact, lawyer-like thing beforehand that reveals the clear, cold sense that always ran underneath the legend. The document deeding the precious gram of radium to her had been drawn up to give it to her personally, as her own property. And she asked, before the ceremony, for the wording to be changed, so that the radium would be given not to Marie Curie the person, but to her laboratory, to the Radium Institute, as a permanent scientific resource, so that on her death it would not pass to her heirs as a private fortune, but would remain forever the property of science, exactly as she believed it should, and the deed was rewritten accordingly before she would sign. She had refused to patent radium for private profit 20 years before, and she refused to inherit it privately now. The gram belonged to the work. She came home from America exhausted but triumphant, with the radium her institute so badly needed, and the American trip became a template. 8 years later, in 1929, older and frailer still, she crossed the ocean a second time, again at Mrs. Maloney's arranging, and again the generosity of the American public bought a second gram of radium. This one intended as a gift to endow a new radium institute in Warsaw, in the reborn Poland, a scientific institute in her home city that her sister Bronya was helping to establish and that would bear the family's name, so that Marie at the end of her life was able to give to the resurrected homeland of her childhood the same gift of radium and of scientific hope that America had given to her. Closing yet another of the long circles that run through this story. Between and around these journeys, the aging Marie Curie lent her enormous prestige to the wider cause of science and of peace. She served for years on an international committee for intellectual cooperation under the League of Nations, the earnest and ultimately doomed attempt after the Great War to bind the nations of the world together and prevent another such catastrophe, working alongside other famous minds of the age, including her friend the physicist Albert Einstein. To promote the free international exchange of scholarship and to defend the idea, so dear to her since the flying university of her Warsaw girlhood, that knowledge belongs to all of humanity and knows no borders. She received honours without end, honorary doctorates by the dozen, memberships in learned societies all over the world, medals, prizes, the freedom of cities. More recognition than any scientist of her time, and she accepted them with a weary, dignified indifference, valuing them mainly for what they could do for her institute and her students, and going home always, as soon as she decently could, to the laboratory and the bench and the work. And she had, in these last years, the deep, quiet satisfaction of watching her science pass into the sure hands of the next generation, and above all, into the hands of her own daughter. Irene had grown into a first-rate physicist in her own right, working in her mother's institute, serious and able and, like her mother, happiest at the bench. And in the year 1926 she married a brilliant young scientist named Frederick Joliot, who worked at the institute too. And the two of them, Irene and Frederick Joliot Curie, joined their names and their work together in exactly the way Marie and Pierre once had, a second scientific marriage of true equals in the same family, bent over the same radioactive problems in the same Paris laboratory. Marie lived to see them well launched, to see her daughter and son-in-law doing important work on the frontier she herself had opened, closing on discoveries of their own. And though she did not live quite long enough to see their greatest triumph, she must have known it was coming, and it is right to say here, running just ahead of the story, that only a year after Marie's death Irene and Frederick would win the Nobel Prize in chemistry themselves, for creating artificial radioactivity, making the mother the head of the only lineage in history in which both a parent and a child won science's highest prize, the radioactive torch, passed cleanly from one generation of the family to the next. The younger daughter, Eve, took the other road, away from the laboratory entirely, into music and journalism and writing and a wide worldly life, and she would become the keeper of her mother's memory, the one who, after everything was over, would sit down and write the loving, clear-eyed biography of her mother that fixed the image of Marie Curie for the world, and that much of what we know most intimately about her still comes from. So the two daughters between them carried the whole of their mother forward, the elder carrying the science and the younger carrying the story. And Marie in her last years could look at both of them and be, in her undemonstrative way, content. But the body, all this while, was failing. The long, slow bill for the glowing work, the decades of unshielded radiation in the shed and the laboratory and the X-ray vans, was at last, in the late 1920s and into the 1930s, coming due in full, and the greatest living scientist in the world was quietly, and at first without quite admitting it even to herself, beginning to die of the very thing she had discovered. It is worth slowing down here, in the long, quiet, late afternoon of the life, to look plainly at the woman as she now was, because the legend by this point had grown so large and so smooth that the actual person can get lost inside it, and the actual person is more interesting than the statue. She was, into her 60s, small and thin and stooping, with grey hair pulled plainly back, dressed nearly always in the same worn dark clothes, austere to the point of severity, indifferent to fashion and comfort and money to a degree that genuinely puzzled the people around her. She kept, all her life, the frugal habits of the poor Warsaw student and the shed years, long after she could have lived in ease, spending almost nothing on herself, giving away far more than she kept, uninterested in possessions, in decoration, in the ordinary rewards that fame and success pour on people. She disliked crowds and small talk and ceremony, was awkward and stiff and shy in public, warmed only in the company of a few, her daughters, her sister, a handful of close scientific friends, and among them could be gentle and even playful, though the playfulness was dry and quiet and easy to miss. She loved the natural world with a deep, steady passion that never left her, loved long walks and swimming and the mountains and gardens and the sea, kept up her cycling into old age, and took her keenest ordinary pleasure in the countryside, in flowers and rivers and open air, the one indulgence her severe nature fully allowed itself. She was stubborn past the point of reason, disciplined past the point of health, incapable of doing anything by halves, and driven always by that early fusion of learning and duty and resistance, the conviction that work was the point of a life, and that the work she did was in some sense owed to Pierre, to Poland, to science, to the poor students who would come after her, to the sick who would be healed. And she was, by the last decade of her life, going slowly blind and quietly poisoning herself, and hiding both. The cataracts came first, a clouding of the lenses of both eyes that thickened year by year until she could barely see, could not read her own instruments, could not recognize faces across a room, a terrible affliction for a scientist whose whole life was precise observation, and she concealed it as long as she possibly could out of pride and fear, memorizing the layout of her laboratory, having her lecture notes written out in enormous letters, colour-coding her apparatus, marking her instruments with tape she could feel, doing everything she could to hide from her students and colleagues that the great Madame Curie could no longer see. In the end, she underwent a series of operations on her eyes, several of them, and here again the fierce private will shows itself, for she went into these operations, terrifying eye surgery in the era before modern techniques, under an assumed name, a false name, checking into the clinic as an ordinary anonymous patient so that no one would know it was Marie Curie under the surgeon's hands, so that there would be no press, no fuss, no crowds, and she came through them, and her sight was partly restored, enough to go on working, and she went back to work and told almost no one what she had endured. And underneath the cataracts, and underneath the constant low ill health, the ringing ears, the exhaustion that never lifted, the recurring fevers, the strange lesions on her ruined fingers, was the thing no one, not even she, fully named until near the very end, which was radiation sickness, the slow cumulative destruction of her body, and above all of her blood and bone marrow, by the ionizing radiation she had lived inside for the better part of 40 years. We understand it now with a clarity that was simply not available then. In the early decades of the work, no one knew that radioactivity in the doses the pioneers received was cumulatively lethal. They handled the glowing salts with bare hands, pipetted radioactive solutions by mouth, carried samples in their pockets, kept tubes of it by the bed to admire the light, worked in rooms saturated with radioactive dust and radon gas, breathed it, absorbed it, lived in it, day after day, year after year, entirely unshielded. And the damage accumulated silently in their tissues, in their marrow, in their bones, decade upon decade, until the body could no longer make healthy blood. The very notebooks Marie kept during the shed years, her laboratory books, her papers, even her cookbooks, are so thoroughly contaminated with radioactivity absorbed across those years that they remain dangerous to this day, kept now in lead-lined boxes, and anyone wishing to examine the actual pages must sign a release acknowledging the risk and handle them with protection, a full century and more after she wrote in them, the physical proof still ticking on a detector of just how much radiation the woman who wrote them lived inside. She had begun to suspect, in a general way, that the beautiful substance she had given her life to was also what was killing her, and had killed others, the young dial painters, some of her own co-workers. But she never truly accepted it about herself, never quite allowed that radium, her radium, the thing she had loved and served and defended, was the hand at her own throat. And perhaps that refusal was a kind of mercy, or perhaps it was only the same stubbornness that had carried her through everything else, refusing to the last to hear a word against the work. And so she went on, half-blind, chronically ill, aging fast, still coming to the institute, still directing the research, still training her students, still, in the mornings, at the bench, growing frailer through the early 1930s, until the failing that had been so gradual for so long began, at last, in the summer of 1934, to move quickly, and the long life to gather itself toward its close. Through the winter and spring of that last year, she had been more than usually unwell, feverish and weak, and troubled by chills that came and went without explanation. And she kept working through them as she had always worked through everything, dragging herself to the institute, unwilling to stop, until in the early summer she could no longer pretend that this was one of her ordinary bouts of tiredness. She was running a persistent low fever, she was profoundly weak, and the doctors who examined her were puzzled, suspecting at first an old tubercular lesion flaring up, the ancient family enemy that had killed her mother, and they recommended what was then recommended for such things: rest and clean mountain air, and so it was arranged that she should be taken to a sanatorium high in the French Alps, at a place called Sanselemos, in the pure cold air of the mountains she had always loved, to rest and, it was hoped, to recover. She made the long journey there in the summer of 1934, so weak by then that she had to be helped, and it was already, in truth, far too late for mountain air to matter. At the sanatorium the doctors at last understood what was actually wrong, or came as close to it as the medicine of the day could come. Her blood was failing. Her bone marrow, the tissue deep in the bones that manufactures the blood, had been so damaged that it could no longer do its work, could no longer make the red and white cells the body needs to live, and her blood counts had fallen to fatal levels. They called it, in the language of the time, a pernicious aplastic anemia, an anemia of the most severe and rapid kind, a failure of the marrow, and they noted that it had come on with an abnormal, galloping speed, and though they could not or would not name the cause with certainty, the true cause is not now in any serious doubt. It was the radiation. Nearly 40 years of it, absorbed into her bones, where radium, chemically so like the calcium the body builds bone from, is taken up and lodged and stays, irradiating the marrow from within, year upon year, until the marrow simply died. The very element she had discovered, isolated with her own hands, named, defended and loved, the shining thing she had given the world, had settled into her bones and quietly destroyed the wellspring of her blood, and now it was taking her life. There was, in that era, no treatment for it, nothing to be done, and there was very little time. She was gravely ill for only a short while at the sanatorium, sinking fast, her mind clouding in and out, her younger daughter Eve at her bedside through the last days, watching over her, and the great fever and the great weakness carried her down, and in the early morning hours of the 4th of July, in the year 1934, in the quiet of the mountain sanatorium, with the clean cold air she had come for coming in at the window, Marie Curie died, at the age of 66. The most decorated scientist of her age, twice a Nobel laureate, the discoverer of two elements, the woman who had opened the door on the inner life of the atom and saved 1 million wounded men and changed forever the treatment of the sick, died worn out and half-blind in a mountain rest home, killed by her own discovery, having given, quite literally, every last thing she had, including her body, to the work. There was no great state funeral, no cathedral, no crowds, and this was exactly as she would have wished it, for she had wanted, at the end, only quiet and privacy, the same things she had wanted all her life and so rarely been allowed. 2 days later she was buried very simply in the small cemetery of the town of Chaux, in the suburbs south of Paris, the town where Pierre's family lay, and she was laid to rest in the Curie family grave, directly above her husband Pierre, in the same earth, together again at last after 28 years apart, the two who had worked as a single mind reunited under a plain stone, with only the family and a few close friends standing by in the summer morning. Her brother Joseph and her sister Bronia, who had come from the reborn Poland she had lived just long enough to see, are said to have each brought with them a handful of soil from Poland, from the homeland, and to have scattered that Polish earth into the French grave, so that the girl from occupied Warsaw, who had carried Poland inside her all her life, and written its name into the heavens as an element, would lie at last with a little of her own country's ground about her, in the foreign land where her work had been done. And there, for a long time in the quiet cemetery at Sceaux, under the plain stone above Pierre, with the Polish soil among the French, the story of her body ends. But the story of what she left behind was only beginning, and it is with that, gently, that we will let the night close. Consider, first, the nearest circle of what she left, the family and the laboratory, because the seed she had planted there came up almost at once. Only some months after Marie was laid in the ground at Sceaux, her elder daughter Irene and her son-in-law Frederick, working on in the very radium institute their mother had built, completed the discovery they had been closing on for years. The making of artificial radioactivity, the astonishing feat of taking ordinary stable matter and, by bombarding it, turning it into new radioactive substances that do not occur in nature, which threw open an enormous door onto the modern world of nuclear physics and nuclear medicine, and gave scientists the ability to make radioactive materials to order rather than laboriously extracting the few. That the Earth provides. And in the year 1935, just 1 year after her death, Irene and Frederick Joliot Curie were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for it, so that Marie, who had been the first woman to win a Nobel Prize and the first person to win two, now became also the mother of a Nobel laureate, and the Curie family entered the record as the most decorated family in the history of science, with, in the end, 5 Nobel Prizes among them across 2 generations, a thing that has no equal anywhere. It is a quiet, moving completion that the daughter who had gone with her mother in the war to X-ray the wounded, who had grown up in the shadow of the shed and the glowing tubes, should carry the work forward to a triumph of her own within a year of the mother's death, the alternating handwriting of Marie and Pierre becoming the joined names of Irene and Frederick, the family way of working, of 2 equals bent over the same radioactive problem, passing whole and living into the next generation. And beyond the family, the science itself, the whole vast field that Marie Curie had, more than any other single person, called into being, went on to remake the 20th century and our own, for good and for ill, in ways she could not have foreseen and would have regarded with a mixture of pride and grave concern. The understanding that the atom has an inner structure and an inner store of energy, which began with her patient measurement that the radiation was a property of the atom itself, led, within decades, through the work of many hands, to the full mapping of the atomic nucleus, to the discovery that that nucleus could be split and could be made to release its enormous energy, and so, along one branch, to nuclear power, the great generating stations that light whole cities from a handful of fuel, and along another and darker branch to the atomic bomb, the weapon that ended a later and even more terrible war, and that has hung over the whole of human life ever since. Marie Curie did not build the bomb, and did not live to see it, dying 11 years before it fell, and it is neither fair nor accurate to lay it at her door, but it is honest to say that the long road to it began in her freezing shed, with her glowing tubes and her ton of black rock, and her insistence on following the invisible rays wherever they led, and that the power she was the first to measure turned out to be one of the largest and most double-edged gifts any human being has ever handed, to the species capable of lighting the world or ending it, and that the woman who opened that door did so entirely in the service of pure knowledge and human healing, and would have been the last person on earth to wish it turned into a weapon. But it was along the gentler branch, the healing branch, that her own heart had always lain, and there her legacy is unclouded and immense. The careful use of radiation to find and to destroy disease, which began with the Curies noticing that radium could burn living tissue, and could therefore, aimed and measured, burn away a tumour, grew into one of the central pillars of modern medicine. The radiation therapy that treats so many cancers today, the X-ray imaging that lets doctors see inside the living body without a single cut, the radioactive tracers that light up the working of the heart and the brain and the bones on a scanner, the whole vast apparatus of nuclear medicine that saves or lengthens millions of lives every year, all of it descends, directly, from the work of the woman in the shed and every hospital in the world that treats a cancer with radiation or takes an X-ray of a broken arm, or runs a scan to catch a disease early, is, in a real and traceable sense, a distant room of the Radium Institute that Marie Curie built. She had refused to patent any of it, had given the process away for free, precisely so that it could spread to every corner of the earth and belong to everyone, and it did, and the countless people who have been healed or spared or given more years by radiation medicine over the past century are the true and living monument to a decision 2 poor scientists made, on principle, in a cold apartment, not to grow rich from the thing they had found, The institutes she founded live on and still bear her name and still do her work. The Curie Institute in Paris that grew out of her Radium Institute, remaining to this day one of the foremost centres in the world for the research and the treatment of cancer. And the Sister Institute in Warsaw, the one the second American gram of radium helped to endow, standing still in her reborn homeland. A working hospital and laboratory carrying her name in the city where she had learned her first physics in secret by lamplight, so that the circle she drew from occupied Warsaw to free Warsaw is not a metaphor, but a set of real buildings full of real doctors curing real patients, her name over the door in the country that had once forbidden her a university. And the elements themselves remain, of course, fixed forever in the great ordered table of everything the universe is made of, radium and polonium, the ray-giving thing and the thing named for a nation that had vanished, her two discoveries taking their permanent places among the fundamental substances of creation, and every chemistry student in every country who learns that table learns. Whether the name is spoken or not, a little of her story, the shed and the black rock folded invisibly into two of the boxes on the wall. For 60 years after her death she lay quietly in the little cemetery at Chaux, above Pierre, with the Polish soil among the French, and the world went on being changed by what she had done, and her name grew, if anything, larger, until she had become something more than a scientist, had become a kind of universal symbol, the first name that comes to almost anyone, anywhere, asked to name a woman of science, the proof, held up in classrooms all over the earth, that the mind has no sex, that genius is not the property of one half of humanity, that a poor girl shut out of every university in her own occupied country could. Nonetheless, by sheer will and sheer ability, climb to the very summit of human knowledge and stand there, twice, alone, and in the year 1995, more than 6 decades after she died, the French Republic did a thing to honour that symbol which had never been done before in the whole history of the nation. It moved her. The remains of Marie Curie, and of Pierre with her, for the two were not to be parted again, were lifted from the family grave at Chaux, and carried in a solemn state procession through Paris to the Pantheon, the great domed temple on the hill of the left bank, where France buries its most honoured citizens, its greatest writers and thinkers and heroes. Beneath the inscription that dedicates the building to the great men of the fatherland, and there, under that dome, in a formal ceremony of the state, with the President of France presiding and speaking her praise, Marie Curie was laid to rest among the immortals of the nation, and in doing so she became the first woman in the entire history of the Pantheon to be enshrined there on the strength of her own achievements, her own work, her own greatness. Rather than as the wife or companion of a great man, the first woman admitted to that company on her own merits alone. There is a fine and fitting irony in it, layered several deep, that the foreign woman, the Pole, the immigrant whom a section of the French press had once tried to drive out of the country as an unworthy outsider, whom the French Academy of Sciences had refused to admit because she was a woman and a foreigner, was carried in the end by the French state itself into the highest and most exclusive, resting place the nation possesses, honoured as one of the supreme glories of France, the door that had been slammed in her living face thrown open, too late for her to see it, to receive her bones with full honours. She would, one suspects, have found the whole thing rather too grand and rather too noisy for her taste, and would privately have preferred to be left in the quiet earth at Chaux with Pierre and the Polish soil. But the living needed the ceremony more than she did, needed to make the gesture, to say publicly and permanently what she had come to mean, and so she lies now under the great dome, the immigrant girl from the vanished country, honoured by the nation that had once mistrusted her, a lesson in stone for everyone who comes after. And it is worth saying plainly, in the quiet of the night, what that lesson is, because it is not, in the end, mainly a lesson about atoms. The physics matters enormously, the two elements, the word radioactivity, the door onto the nucleus, the healing of the sick, all of it real and all of it lasting. But the deeper thing the life teaches is something simpler and more human and more useful to an ordinary person lying awake in the dark, and it is about what steady, patient, unglamorous persistence can do, over a long time, against long odds, without shortcuts. Everything she achieved slowly, and by refusing to stop. She did not have a single sudden stroke of magic luck. She had a locked door at the university and she studied in secret. She had no money, and she waited years as a governess and sent her wages to her sister. She had no laboratory, and she worked in a freezing shed. She had no pure radium, and she boiled a ton of rock by hand to get a speck of it. She lost her mother and her sister and then her husband, each loss enough to stop a life, and each time she went back, the next morning, to the bench. She was rejected by the academy and shamed by the newspapers, and she got on a train to Stockholm and accepted her prize. She went blind, and she memorized her laboratory and kept working. She was, above everything else she was, a person who did not quit, who believed that the way through was to keep on, quietly, one measurement at a time, one day at a time, and who was proven right, again and again, across a long hard life, until the persistence itself became a kind of greatness larger than any single discovery. That is the thing worth carrying down into sleep tonight. If any of it is, not the chemistry, but the patience, the plain stubborn unglamorous decency of a person who kept her promises and did her work and gave away what she found and never made much noise about any of it, and changed the world more than almost anyone of her century, from a shed with cracked hands in a dark blue dress. There are a few more threads worth gathering up gently before we let the night close, small quiet ones that round out the woman and the world she moved through. Consider the strange company she kept at the very summit of science, for she was, in her later decades, one of a tiny handful of people who sat at the very top of physics in what was probably the single greatest era that physics has ever had. She attended, more than once, the famous scientific gatherings of the age, the great conferences at which the small number of minds then remaking our whole picture of the universe would come together in one room to argue it out, and there exists a well-known photograph of one such gathering in which she sits, the one woman among a couple of dozen men, calm and plain and grey among the founders of modern physics. And the striking thing, when you know who they all are, is that she does not look out of place, does not look like a guest or a mascot, but sits among them as exactly what she was, a peer, one of the makers, entirely at home at the highest table there was. Among that company she counted the physicist Albert Einstein as a genuine friend, one of the few people whose company she truly enjoyed, and the two of them, the shy Polish widow and the rumpled German-born theorist, took walking holidays together in the mountains with their families, talking physics along the trails, and Einstein, who did not hand out praise lightly and was not much impressed by fame, said of her after her death, the thing that cuts closest to the truth of her, that of all the celebrated people he had known, she was the only one whom fame had not corrupted, the one who had remained, through all of it, entirely unspoiled, entirely herself. That is a rare thing to be able to say of anyone who becomes as famous as she became, and it was said by someone in a position to know, and it is worth setting down as perhaps the single most accurate sentence anyone ever spoke about her character. Consider, too, the quieter legacy she left in the people she trained, because for all that she is remembered as a lone towering figure, she spent the whole second half of her life as a teacher and a director of research, and her laboratory, her Radium Institute, became a place where a whole generation of young scientists learned the new science at its source, many of them from her homeland and from other countries where opportunity was scarce, and a remarkable number of them, deliberately, women. She opened her laboratory to women scientists at a time when almost nowhere else in the world would have them, gave them real work and real training and real careers, and sent them out to laboratories and universities across Europe and beyond, so that the woman who had herself been shut out of every university in occupied Poland spent her own eminence prying the doors open for the ones who came. After her, quietly, without speeches, simply by hiring them and teaching them and taking their work seriously, and the line of women in the physical sciences that runs through the 20th century and into our own owes a great deal, at its root, to the plain fact that Madame Curie would give a talented young woman a bench when no one else would. Consider as well the darker education the world was slowly receiving, all through her later life, in the true nature of the beautiful glowing stuff. The reckless radium craze of the early years, the tonics and the creams and the glowing paint, could not go on forever without a terrible bill, and it came due most cruelly for a group of young women in the watch-making trade, the dial painters, who through the 1910s and 20s sat at long benches painting glowing radium numbers onto the faces of watches and clocks and instrument dials so that they could be read in the dark, and who were taught to keep a fine point on their little brushes, by drawing them to a point between their lips again and again, all day, swallowing with each stroke a trace of radium that lodged, like all radium, in their bones, until years later their jaws and their bones began to rot and crumble, and they sickened and died in numbers, in agony, of what was done to them by a substance everyone had been told was healthful. Their suffering, and the long fight some of them waged to have the truth of it recognized, was one of the hard, grim ways that the world finally learned what radiation in the body actually does, and it changed at last how the substance was handled, brought in the shielding and the rules and the caution that had been utterly absent in the shed, too late for the dial painters, and too late, though she would not quite say so, for Marie herself. It is a sombre thing to hold alongside the wonder that the same rays which heal the sick when aimed with knowledge will destroy the healthy when handled in ignorance, that the gift and the poison are the very same thing, differing only in whether the hand that wields it understands what it is holding, and the whole modern discipline of protecting people from radiation. The careful measured caution with which every hospital and laboratory now treats these materials is built on the graves of the pioneers and the dial painters who found out the hard way, first among them, in her own quiet fashion, the discoverer herself, and consider, finally and most gently, the private woman at the centre of it all, in her ordinary hours, away from every discovery and every prize. Picture her on a summer evening in the last years, at the small house she loved in Brittany by the sea, or in the mountains she went to for air, an old grey, stooped, half-blind woman in a shapeless dark dress, walking slowly along a path among the flowers she could no longer quite see, but could still smell, or sitting quietly by the water at the end of a long day, having done that day. As every day her work, her correspondence, her measurements, her patient endless service to the institute and the students and the science, and then, in the failing light, simply resting, a person who had wanted, from the very beginning, from the glass case of instruments in her father's flat in the captured city, only to understand how the world was made, and who had understood a piece of it more deeply than almost anyone ever has, and had paid for the understanding with her eyes and her blood and her bones, and had thought the price on the whole worth paying, and was, in her severe, undemonstrative way, at peace with all of it. That is the woman to keep in mind as we let her go, not the statue under the dome, but the tired, contented old scientist by the sea in the evening, who kept every promise she ever made, and did the work, and gave it away, and asked for nothing, and changed everything. So let us go back, one last time, very slowly, to where we began, to the shed in the courtyard on the cold night near the end of the old century, and stand in the doorway once more, now that we know the whole of the life that ran out from it. The young woman in the stained dark dress has put down her heavy iron rod at last. The great vats have cooled. The lamp is out. And on the shelves along the wall, in the little glass tubes ranged there in the blackness, the faint bluish light is glowing, soft and cool and living, needing no flame, going out never. And she is standing there in the dark, with the tall gentle man beside her, the two of them tired past speaking, simply looking at the light they have wrung out of the earth. She does not know, in that moment, any of what is coming. She does not know that the glow she loves is already at work in her bones. She does not know about the prizes, the two of them, or the shaming in the newspapers, or the rainy street where she will lose him, or the vans she will drive through the mud of a war not yet imagined, or the crowds in America, or the dome in Paris where they will one day carry her. She knows only that she was right, that there was something hidden in the black rock, and that she found it, and that it is beautiful, and that is enough for tonight. And the truth is that the light in those tubes never really went out. It went out for her in the mountain sanatorium on a July morning when the marrow gave up and the tired heart stopped. But the thing itself, the discovery, the knowledge, the shift she made in how we understand what everything is made of, that did not stop. And does not stop, and will not stop. It is glowing still, in 10,000 hospitals, where a machine born of her insight finds a shadow on a lung in time to save a life, in the quiet rooms where the sick are treated with the rays she was the first to measure, in the laboratories that still bear her name in Paris and in the reborn Warsaw, in the 2 small boxes on the periodic table, in the mind of every girl anywhere who is told that she cannot, and who thinks of the poor governess who studied by lamplight and became the greatest of them all, and decides that she can. History does not really disappear. The people go into the ground, and their griefs and their fevers and their cold sheds go with them, and the newspapers that screamed at them yellow and crumble, and the men who slammed the doors are forgotten with the doors. But the true things they found, the things they wrenched out of the dark by patience and would not let go of, those remain, and become part of the ground the rest of us stand on, the quiet permanent floor beneath the feet of everyone who comes after. So that we walk, all of us, all our lives, without ever thinking about it, on the accumulated stubborn discoveries of people like the small tired woman in the doorway of the shed, watching her tubes glow, at the end of a long day, near the end of the old century, with everything still ahead of her. And now it is late, and the night has gone very deep and very still around you, and there is nothing left in the story that needs you awake for it. She is at rest under the dome above Pierre with the Polish soil among the French, and the work goes on without her, glowing quietly in its 10,000 rooms, and you can let all of it go now. The shed and the black rock, and the glowing tubes and the long grey road she walked from the occupied city to the temple of the nation. Let it drift off into the dark like the last of the birch smoke over the rooftops, and let yourself go with it, down and down into sleep. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to be, not any longer, for the story is told and the lamp is out and the light is put away on its shelf in the dark, safe and glowing and patient. If some part of you is still here, listening, then there is another quiet life waiting for you on the screen when you are ready for it. Another long, slow story to carry you down another night. And it will keep. It is in no hurry, and neither are you. And if you have found some comfort here tonight, in this soft company in the dark, you might, only if you truly wish to, leave a like or follow along, so that these calm, slow lives can find the others who are lying awake as you were, all over the turning world. But that is for the morning, or for whenever you like, and it does not matter now. Now there is nothing left to do at all. Let your breathing go slow and long and even. Let the last of the day dissolve. Let the small weight of everything slip down off your shoulders and pool on the floor and be gone. Rest now. You have done enough for one day, more than enough, and the night will hold you gently until the morning. Close your eyes. Let the glow fade softly to nothing. Good night and sweet dreams.